I'm Xiang Zhen, the Vice President of Advisory here in Ensign Info Security.
And my name is Buck. I'm a manager at Ensign Info Security and will be your host for today.
Yes, Benjamin, maybe a short introduction of yourself.
And I'm Ben. I'm the head of the Center of Excellence for National Security, which is a policy research think tank based at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU in Singapore.
Great, so we are off to a very interesting start. This podcast is directly fresh off the publication of the Ensign Info Security Cyber Threat Landscape Report 2023, which is our fourth edition of our annual publishing. I thought it's meaningful for us to kind of lay a bit of the backdrop before we go into the theme proper. So the theme for today's episode is essentially the role of public-private partnership and academia in Asia's unique threat environment. Now, to circle back to what we've actually published in our threat landscape report, there are a few key things that we've observed across the different territories that Ensign actually operates in, namely Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Indonesia. Now, one of the most important things that we've observed thus far essentially is the spray and pray threat groups. These are largely made up by ransomware threat groups. Of course, we did find an outlier, which is the Lazarus Group, famously associated with the North Korea regime, which, other than working towards financial gain, like many of the ransomware threat groups, they have other interests such as information theft and espionage, as well as some elements of disruption and destruction. Now, moving forward to the more targeted threat groups that we've seen across the 5 territories, we actually saw 2 threat groups, Lotus Blossom and Nikon, specifically targeting Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And another interesting fact that we found out was that 2 Malay-speaking territories that we operate in, Malaysia and Indonesia, were commonly targeted by the same threat groups. And these are Desorden, Dark Pink, Nikon, and Lotus Blossom. Now, one more very interesting thing that we saw in this particular edition of the Threat Landscape Report was that the kind of vacation of the Russian-associated threat groups and the filling of the void by the Chinese-associated threat groups, which largely we think is associated to the fact that the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues, and the Russian-associated threat groups probably are spending their attentions and efforts more towards the conflict region. Now, thematically, the motivations that we've seen operating across the 5 territories largely focus itself into information theft and espionage, as well as financial gain. So that's being the landscape. We have Benjamin here. I'd like to tap into your experience and knowledge working with the regions, many of the public policy persons that are leading our region. What are the perspectives or what resonates really from the threat landscape report? What alternative or other perspectives that may not have been reported in the reported in our edition of this report? And any other interesting insights that you have gathered across all your different conversations?
Thanks a lot, Xiang Zhen. And what really struck me was that the Russian threat groups are leaving the region and they're being replaced by other threat groups, for example, China. And this is very interesting because we've seen also in our look at geopolitics that the Russian cybercrime groups, many of them have aligned with the Russian state and are participating in the Russia-Ukraine war. And so it looks like their resources are definitely being diverted there. And it also looks like they are not immune to their own geopolitical strains, since some groups have had to split because they've been like half Russian and half Ukrainian, and those two halves are no longer able to work together because their countries are at war. So that's something interesting to note in the geopolitical landscape, how it affects the Asian situation, since that we've not really had a decrease but just a substitution. It remains to be seen. So that's going to be interesting if the objectives of the different cybercrime groups are still basically about the same and their targets are still basically about the same. That's still no good news for the Asian businesses.
Do you think some of these insights are meaningful to public policy makers, and how would they actually take this kind of inputs towards their strategic plans, designs of policy for the different jurisdictions that exist in Asia?
Well, the situation in Asia is complicated because of the fact that while Russia did not have close trading relationship with a lot of Southeast Asian countries, well, although it had with some, then China has close trading relationships with many Southeast Asian countries, and it's a fine balance to see if China can help to bring down the number of cyber attacks that's originating from its territory, or whether Southeast Asian countries are going to be able to make use of that trading relationship to try to get some assistance in terms of getting the cyber attacks on them reduced.
So one of the key focus that we have seen over the past couple of years, as well as something that we expect to still be a concern for organizations in the next 2 or 3 years, is ransomware. There have been some move by public policy makers in Europe on how organizations are expected to handle ransomware. For example, if they want to claim insurance payment for ransom or ransomware-related incidents, they need to report to the regulators. Do you foresee that this kind of evolution in ransomware to affect policy decision-making in Asia and in Singapore specifically?
This is going to be challenging in Asia as well because of the ability of a lot of payments to be made off the books. And I think that we have had an issue of money laundering being a problem in many Asian countries. This may drive, in fact, the problem of ransomware payments underground, which is an unintended consequence. Because actually what we want from actually regulation like that is more knowledge and better transparency. And in some ways, not just a stick, but a carrot would probably help if the policymakers are able to give assistance to ransomware victims so that they don't feel that they are being pulled in two directions.
I think the developments, particularly relating to ransomware, has been interesting because we are also seeing many players in the ecosystem relating to ransomware response take different steps at it. We've seen certain insurers and reinsurers take a particular stance to say, I will not support the payment of ransoms, especially if they are state-sponsored in nature. Question out there, which is how do you actually finally attribute it to a state-sponsored actor? We've also seen certain organizations where they take a hard stance to then say and publicly state it that, I will not pay for any ransoms, much like how in terrorism ransoms are made. I want to align that policy. And it's actually changed the way ransomware, cyber insurance premiums actually play out. Are you able to share any insights about what are some of the public policy makers actually thinking in response to this? For one example that I'm aware of in Singapore, and now recently discussed in ASEAN, is about the ransomware response task force or a counter ransomware task force. Maybe you can shed some light about those initiatives.
So that's interesting because it is clear that the task force is really looking into countermeasures, and that's really a key part of what is needed by the businesses. The businesses were, in a way, trying to push off the risk by insuring it. I think now as it becomes harder to insure against the risk, then it's necessary to take steps to actually be able to prevent, be able to remediate, be able to recover from ransomware attacks. And the more help that businesses can get, especially the large number of SMEs throughout the whole region who don't have the resources, don't have the training, don't have the knowledge of how to deal with a ransomware attack, then the better it will be for the whole of the region.
I think one thing that is very anecdotal in the Asia region as well as ASEAN is the very unequal maturity of cybersecurity, understanding, defense, and actions or controls in addressing some of the challenges that we clearly face. Part of that conversation really is about the workforce development, the talent nurturing and capacity that we have. How do we actually go towards confidence building? And the approaches towards collaboratively or collective response or collective defense. Knowing your position and exposure in the Asia and ASEAN region, what are some of the initiatives that you see good promise in helping us go towards this collective defense and more meaningful confidence building and capacity building outcomes?
What I really like is the UN Singapore Cyber Program and the UN Singapore Cyber Fellowship. And these were initiated by the ASEAN Ministers Cyber Conference, the AMCC, which is held every year at the Singapore International Cyber Week, SICW, which is just around the corner. And in one of these annual meetings, it was decided that since Singapore had developed capacity building programs for ASEAN, then the UN would also assist in this cyber capacity building programs and help to take some of the learnings from this and share it with the rest of the world as well. So it's a great endorsement for what is being done in this region, really to bring together the officials from all 10 ASEAN countries to be able to basically raise their knowledge, raise their awareness, whether it's at a policy level, strategic level, or even at a technical level, that they'll be able to have a better knowledge that can defend themselves. Because in the end, it's the weakest link in the whole of ASEAN that will be the dangerous point. And the defense of one is really the defense of all. So it is not a collective defense in the sense of a NATO collective defense where you attack one and then all will come and respond, but rather that all will help to build each other's knowledge and expertise up. And I find that that's really good also in building confidence in one another, that confidence building measure so that you know that you have somebody, a counterpart in a neighboring country whom you can ask. If you see a cyber attack coming from that neighboring country, you can say, hey, I noticed that there are some attacks coming from an IP in your territory. Can you help me to stop it? Because I can't go into your country, but you've got police, you've got your own authorities. Please help me to catch these guys. And that's really going to be essential in the years to come.
Yeah. And I guess therein lies the need for established protocols, MOUs, and a willingness to participate in such collective defense efforts. I like the fact that you brought up about, there are dependencies across the region, and the word cyber supply chain comes into my mind, the risks involved in the cyber supply chain. I'm a core member in the Geneva Dialogue, which is advocating for responsible behaviors in cyberspace, and I know you are a contributing member as well. It's quite clear these days organizations, businesses, individuals depend on many services and technologies that are not unique to just their native location or their residential location, but extending beyond borders, extending beyond controls of nations to the extent of technology, powerhouses, companies, and so on. And it is also a UN cyber norm goal to actually establish cyber supply chain risk management for a global effort. How do you think Asia, or maybe I ask it differently, where do you think Asia is in this journey? And how do you think we can move in a more positive direction towards managing cyber supply chain risk management?
I think a positive way to look about it is that we are starting on the journey. There is an awareness. The ASEAN countries have started on this program called the Norms Implementation Checklist to develop a checklist of things you need to do to implement the norms. And one of them you mentioned is the norm that the supply chain should be protected. And whether it's the software supply chain or the hardware supply chain, it is really crucial to have more capacity building so that in each member state, you're able to understand where the different elements of your supply chain are, what your interdependencies are, and so that you can then put in place the strategies to mitigate risk, whether it's bill of materials, right, bill of goods, or whether it's to have legislation or regulation to make sure that every party along the line has accountability for the integrity of their software. So that capacity building is really crucial because not every country in the region is ready to do that.
And I think therein lies the need for good situation awareness and threat intelligence. This year itself, Ensign Infosecurity signed up as a research sponsor for MITRE and Genuity Center for Threat Informed Defense, for one purpose is really to participate in a wider group of international experts in cybersecurity, and also to help generate public good in terms of the intellectual property that will be generated out of the research, which will be for public access, and really to advocate for more of these kind of practices, like how do you actually address cyber supply chain risk management and many others. But I think where I was going towards, and you touched that point, is that the supply chain is actually very intricate, and you actually need to start off with documenting and inventorizing what is inside your supply chain, and it cuts across software, hardware, and I actually advocate that vendors are also part of that list. And then from there, you kind of layer it on with intelligence to be able to match it up with vulnerabilities that you're aware of, and also couple that with information sharing mechanisms, intelligence sharing mechanisms across the ecosystem, thereby the collective defense approach, to really be able to kind of tell your neighbor that I'm under duress, and maybe you can watch out for me, or at least don't give me more problems while I'm under duress. So I think that's an interesting angle that I want to put forth. But I'm going to go into that topic, which is I see an important trigram of relationships when it comes to collective defense. In conventional play, we see a binary field, which is, there's the governments, which is the public, and then there's the privates, which is the organizations and the people that actually provide services relating towards cybersecurity. But I think the academia also bring an interesting lens, which you are also a representative of, to kind of balance the different perspectives, kind of give strategic, long-term views, as well as with the private sector as well as the public sector, some of the short-term and medium-term objectives. What do you have to say, and in your experience working with the region, how has this played out? Is it in a good trajectory? Can we do better, and what should we do more?
And this is a conversation we've had many times in the past, right? And I really see that there's an importance to have all three parts, all three legs of this tripod for the whole system to be stable. Because the public sector has the reach and has the regulatory and policy levers, the private sector has the knowledge, the skills, the resources, the expertise, and then the academia has the ability to be neutral and to take a long stand. Because for many policymakers, they have operational current needs. They have fires to fight. They have different priorities that their nation needs. Then for companies, you have your numbers to reach, and you have the earnings calls to be able to deal with. And because of that tension, we see that there is sometimes a difficulty for the public sector to directly engage the private sector, that they are worried they are being sold to. But with the academia as the third leg, we are able to say, let's bring you into the room together, let's convene it, and we are the neutral broker. We say, we take the long view of what, and give you that long perspective. You have to, of course, balance it with what is the current needs, but we try to create that environment where public and private can cooperate together without concerns about procurement, concerns about bottom lines.
So speaking of this topic, what do you think are the more successful models in the global stage of partnership between academics and public sector, or academics and the private sector? How should we fund, and how should we decide the direction of research done by academics? And how should the government get involved in such partnership?
I like one example which is very close to home, which is the UN Singapore Cyber Fellowship and the UN Singapore Cyber Program. And when I mentioned that we are actually doing capacity building for the whole ASEAN, the question is, who's doing this training? Because it can't just be a bunch of academics talking about theoretical things. It's so important to have experts from the private sector with real hands-on knowledge of what's happening on the ground to be able to come and provide that training. Then it's mediated by academia. The academics are able to mediate the program so that the government people are not worried that it's a sales pitch. but it's actually info sharing. So I like to think that that's been working out pretty well.
Well, one thing about information sharing, as you touched on that point, is that my personal view is that within Asia, there's a lot more informal information sharing approaches as compared to when we go towards the West. There are more established structured protocols, the ISACs being one of the most established organization structures that are around. How do you think that plays to against our diversity of cultural variety within Asia? And is there a good model that we should be working towards, or maybe the world is comfortable with having several different types of models that exist?
I think that actually is something we have to consider, that the Asian mind is different from the European mind. And the way in which the individual certs are able to actually communicate with one another in ASEAN is actually very valuable. And do we necessarily need to create an artificial kind of environment? And they already have their combined drills. They already have their interactions. So if that's working out, then I think encourage that. Then it also helps that if they are comfortable on a informal level and comfortable at many levels, because it doesn't just have to be cert to cert, also police force to police force.
Like through Interpol.
Cybercrime, through Interpol.
Yeah.
There are other ways to work without having to always have an MOU. So at least among friendly nations, we can be able to cooperate pretty well.
But I guess the so-called Asian model requires a lot of relationship reinforcement, because you kind of need to know who's the other party on the other side, and then you need to have relative levels of trust.
Yes.
So as to be able to then say, I have this piece of information. I'm not going through reporting yet, but maybe as an early warning, I'm going to give you a heads up about this. And because I trust you, see what you want to do with this. But this is the piece of information.
Absolutely. And trust actually is a big thing that we cannot take for granted in Asia. Because think about it, it is a face question. If you have been compromised, what Asian company wants to disclose that they have been hacked? Because other than the legal repercussions or the reputational repercussions, the face is such a big issue. Then the question of being threat information sharing becomes very secondary to that.
I'd like to touch a little bit of interesting discourse towards the fact that, in my personal observation, the technology sphere is starting to kind of bifurcate. We are seeing nuances of a Western technology stack and the emergence of a kind of Eastern technology stack, if I will, largely played out through the sanctions that technology-related sanctions that are being put on each other from the US and China perspectives. And it's playing out meaningfully in economic ramifications. It's playing out meaningfully in terms of how businesses are starting to think about, how do I architect my environment? Will I embrace dual technology stacks? Will I embrace and choose a bias on one particular technology stack, for which the most part of the world has been very Western biased for the longest time? But now there is a so-called viable alternative in the Eastern stack that is emerging. I know there are recent articles to say that new technology, new semiconductors are now appearing from from the Eastern stack, right? How do you think that plays out in Asia, where, in my view, generally there is a preference towards economic outcomes, meaning it's the value for money solutions, and Western stack isn't usually the most economical in nature? How do you think that play out for us, kind of stuck in the middle, especially in ASEAN?
And of course, the standard line from ASEAN countries is that don't ask us to choose. So it becomes a real difficulty at the policymaker level to say, should I take a stand for the Western stack, as you call it, or the Eastern stack? And if we look at the Singapore policy position, is we will go with the stack that fits the international standards or the requirements of our
own
tenders,
needs.
Which is saying everything and not saying anything at all. But in many ways, a lot of countries already have obligations that transcend questions of cybersecurity or technology. And sometimes we have to take into perspective that they have trade requirements, they have economic requirements, and they will make those decisions based on that. And the cybersecurity is one of several factors that will make that decision. Maybe on the bright side, if you want to look at it, there is the possibility of having a resilient ecosystem, because now you are not only having one choice. If that ever fails you, you have another choice. That's trying to be optimistic about it.
I think you hit the nail on the head, right, in terms of diversity of choices. And in many times when we are talking about secure architecture, security engineering, we want to talk about diversity of solutions, diversity of sources of different parts of your supply chain. But I'm reconnecting that conversation back towards the talent pool. We've invested in history, right? A lot of our people towards a particular stack, the Western stack. And then now with the emergence of the Eastern stack, you kind of have to almost choose to invest your resources wisely. Do you train the same limited talent pool on both stacks, or do you kind of split them in the middle and say, half of you take the Western stack, half of you take the Eastern stack? My challenge, the way I see it, being a consultant, is then actually is very limited in terms of the resources that we have, and how do we actually invest in our people sufficiently so that they are competent and really good in the defense operation, strategic planning, and the technical responses, right? So maybe if you have any thoughts around that challenge that I see.
It's a tough one, I have to agree. And the only consolation is that all kinds of resilience and having redundancies is going to be expensive. And if that's what it takes, then unfortunately you may have to consider it as part of the process also. Because even on the Western stack, different technologies go obsolete. You have to learn new ones.
Yes.
And if the new one is very, very different, as sometimes there are huge changes in the structure of the technology,
Yes.
it's almost as complex as learning a different stack, so to speak.
Right.
So maybe it's not that different after all.
But for me, I think it's like people like us. If you ask me to learn a new language, it will take a bit of an investment. It will take a bit of a struggle, and translating between the languages that I'm already familiar with versus the new language that I'm trying to acquire will take a lot of mental gymnastics. I think the same will go for the embracing of a diverse technology stack, where you're learning or you already have learned and invested sufficiently in one particular technology stack, and then now you're trying to learn the other way. And the bifurcation that I'm observing, as I call it, is becoming acute, in the sense that the philosophies, the design, the concepts that are being applied with the Eastern stack actually do represent some paradigm shifts in the way they are thinking about the architectures, the way they are thinking about how defense can be laid out, and so on. And so in that contrasting field of different technology stacks, then the defender actually is stuck with saying, but I've learned so much in that one technology stack, and I know how to put certain controls, lay out certain engineerings to be able to hold that line. But then the Eastern one is like, oh, actually it's a different philosophy altogether. I need to remaster
That's really
everything.
interesting. Can you give an example of this? Because it's
So
fascinating.
I think in semiconductor design, as an example, in the Western stack, we are seeing more GPU centric. There's the deep processing pathways. We see common shared architectures and whatnot. Whereas in the Eastern stack, we are seeing reprogrammable but clunky semiconductors, but being very highly competent. They might burn a few more process cycles to be able to achieve similar outcomes, but they are highly dynamic. They can switch midway, and they are more flexible and agile in the way the outputs and the predictable pathways that they will generate the compute outcomes, right? So that level of dynamism is contrasting with a more structured expectation, a more consistent expectation of certain compute architectures that we've seen in the past. Now, even though the eastern architectures are not necessarily net new, but they are taking a modern look and a very deep expression of how that pathway could be realized. Some of the foundational concepts were also born from the West in the first place. But nonetheless, they're taking a very interesting spin about it. When we look towards operating system design, many newcomers, regardless of whether East or West, would typically look towards the open source stack. So you have your Linux as an example to start your base on. But the way they choose and architect the operating system would deviate quite significantly from what is the mainstream, if I were to put it, the Western approaches of the Linux operating system. So these are some of the semblances that I'm observing, which is quite drastic.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's where I think from a defender's perspective, that's where some of the challenges are. Yeah.
Oh, I agree with you. That really sounds very challenging.
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting conversation that we've had so far. We've touched quite a few topics in the range, going back to the theme, which is the role of the public-private partnership and academia in Asia's unique threat environment. We've touched the nerve about what we see in the cyber threat landscape in the region. We've talked a little bit about how public, private, as well as academia partnerships actually come about, and you've highlighted about the UN Singapore Fellowship and Partnership programs. We've spoken a little bit about some of the geopolitical tensions that we see unique in Asia and how maybe we might not take a partisan view towards how the developments are. We've spoken at length about how supply chain actually is so deep and wide in terms of economic, geopolitical implications, and how everyone has to balance their own needs. And last but not least, we are now touching about the bifurcation of technologies that is now emerging more and more prominently due to economic sanctions and whatnot. I think in summary, this touches a broad perspective of everything, and I thank you for your insights and viewpoints. I think this will be has actually been a very good start to our podcast series, which covers a broad range, and I think we will go into deeper discussions in the subsequent episodes on specific areas.
Thank you, Benjamin, for staying with us throughout this episode. That's it for today. Until our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.